Hey folks, welcome to Monday Mornings with Connor. This is a first in a series of videos that I'm doing where I'm going to talk about some personal stuff, all very real stuff, hopefully entertaining though, and I'm going to avoid stuff like coronavirus or presidential politics. That's not something I really want in my feed right now, so I'm going to stay away from those. Instead, today I'd like to tell you about two very real human beings in my life that were amazing, the SEAL and the priest. This goes back to my time in the Navy, and I'm going to get to why I'm discussing these two specific men at the end of the video, but just for now, let's just dive right into their stories because they're both fascinating. I went to boot camp, and then I went to A school. A school, for those of you not in the know, is where you go after you've gone to boot camp, and you're learning whatever your particular trade is going to be. And my particular trade was intelligence, spy work. So for the Navy. So I was in training school for that, and there I met a group of guys. We all had sort of like a dorm room style living. So there's four of us to a cubicle, and the group of us who were in my cubicle and across from us got to be really good friends. And one of them, whose name I'm going to leave as Steve Rogers for this story, Steve was amazing. He bunked across from me, and charisma doesn't really do him justice. You can see here with the yellow arrow pointing to him. It goes way beyond charisma. He's the kind of guy that, when you see certain military movies, there are soldiers who profess their sort of willingness to lay down and die for their leader. That's this guy. Steve had a way of communicating with people, with leading people, with inspiring people that I'm not sure I've ever seen with other people. I've seen lots of people with charisma. That's easy. You see it lots in the board game community. You see it lots in bands that I've worked with, actors, all of that. That's easy. This is something else, and you don't see it too often. Anyway, so Steve and our group we're pretty tight. We had a great time, and I could give you half a dozen easily really amazing stories about him. But I'll just say that he was like no other human being that I had met in my life. And as an 18-year-old kid, I really looked up to him. I had a serious non-sexual crush on the guy. Like I wanted to be him. I wanted to be around him all the time. And whatever he was doing, that was the cool thing. And he never came off as though he was the cool one. In any case, so one of the things that the A school does for some folks is that it acts as a fallback if you are going on to another job and you don't succeed. Specifically, I'm referring to the training school for Navy SEALs, which is called BUDS, or Basic Underwater Demolition. And so if you're going to become a Navy SEAL, most folks don't make it. Most folks fail out of that test. And so they have to have a job to fall back on when they fail out. So they go to A school first, and then they go on to become a Navy SEAL. And there were a few folks who were in our A school who said they were going to become a Navy SEAL and go on to BUDS after the school, which great. Steve was one of them, and I feel like right away he was one of the few that I could see him passing the school. So after A school, I didn't see him again, and still haven't to this day. But that's not where the story ends. I recently decided to try and find him again on Facebook. No luck. And I, did a little bit of Google foo, and I didn't come across anything except for one thing: this photo. Now, it doesn't have his name captioned under it, but I'm going to get to that in a second. I'm convinced this is Steve Rogers, and I just could immediately tell, despite the age and the beard. There's a short article that went along with this photo. Here from Steve Rogers, a retired member of the Navy SEAL team that led the mission to rescue Captain Phillips, held hostage by Somali pirates in 2009. The hijacking of Captain Phillips' ship and his rescue by the SEAL team was the subject of a major motion picture in 2013. You can read the rest there yourself. This really caught me off guard. I was not expecting to find this information, and since he doesn't have any other information floating around about him on the web that I could dig up, I suspect this probably wasn't okayed by him, or the military for safety reasons. Um, so that's the story of Steve Rogers, and I'm so glad that he made it. I'm so glad that he made a difference in some people's lives, and I have no doubt that he is still the uh, beacon to other human beings the way he was to me. So let's jump on to our second person. This is the ship I served aboard, the USS Tarawa. It's an amphibious aircraft. It carries both sailors and Marines. As you can see, it's got a flight deck and helicopters and carriers, and we carried a ton of folks on board there. And we had a couple of chaplains on board. I'm not a religious person, but we had a couple of chaplains. The ship's chaplain, who I did not get along with, and then the squadron chaplain. Our ship happened to be the flagship of the squadron, so we had an administrative group on there. And while this administrative chaplain was not directly my superior officer or in any way connected to me, he made himself available to a lot of the sailors on board the ship. And my experience with him was very unique. When I got overseas, I was an 18-year-old kid. I didn't know what the hell I was doing. And immediately I heard about this chaplain who, when we were in port, in some foreign town, whether it was the Philippines or Thailand or Hong Kong, he would always announce where he was going to be. He would invite enlisted sailors to come join him. He would buy the drinks. The rule was you don't leave the table and you go back to the ship with him at the end of the night. This way, all the sailors were staying safe. He could keep an eye on his flock, as it were. And I just thought that was really cool. It was so different compared to the other officers, and it immediately endeared me to him. But it became much more personal when somebody in my life back home died suddenly. And that's a story for another time. Like I said, I'm going to keep this story upbeat, so we're going to avoid that story for now. But somebody died, and he was really there for me. He stepped up and gave me advice and comforted me. He never pushed religion on me. He knew I was, I think at the time I was agnostic, and he was really good about just being there for me as a human being, and it meant a lot. And when we got back from overseas, he called out to a few of us that he'd spoken to on a more one-on-one basis, and he gave us his business card and said, "Hey, here's my address in San Diego. I know you guys are living on the ship and you don't have a lot of places to go, but if you ever want to like grab a beer, some pizza, or go grab a movie or whatever, I'm available." On two different occasions, we ended up taking up on that. One time, he took a pair of us to an Italian restaurant that was amazing, and I had my first instance of linguine and white clam sauce. Absolutely incredible. But then on a separate occasion, we just happened to be in the neighborhood. We were thinking about renting some movies at a Blockbuster and taking a pizza back to the ship. And we realized that he was nearby. We knocked on his door and he was there. He invited us in. We ended up getting pizzas and beer and watching the movies at his place. It was a fantastic time. So I left the military and years went by. And similar to Steve Rogers, I decided at one point that I wanted to look him up, and I couldn't find anything. And I sort of gave up on it. And then years later, I wrote a book. I wrote a book called Five's Fate, which has three protagonists from New York City, one of whom happens to be a Catholic priest. And I named this character Michael DeStefano after Neil DeStefano, the priest who helped me out on the Tarawa. I couldn't think of a better person who exemplified the character that I wanted in my book. Somebody who had religious values, but who cared deeply for everyone and was approachable in a way that I had not seen many religious leaders be. In any case, so I wrote this book, and I was very proud of that book, still am. And a couple of years went by, and I thought about looking him up again. And this time I went beyond just, Facebook or whatever it was when I had originally looked him up. And this is the article I came across. Neil DeStefano, a former Navy chaplain who was sentenced to 5 years in prison in 1994 after pleading guilty to drugging and molesting 2 Marines. He was dismissed from the Navy and resigned from the Jesuit religious order. It was a tremendous failure of moral responsibility on my part, as an officer and a priest. I read that a couple of years ago, and it was like a slap in the face. Um, it it was crushing to me. Um, I had built up this man to be one thing, and here was this article saying that he was something else. Not only do you have all of the misbehavior, misconduct, and cover-ups involved in military behavior surrounding sexual assault and rape, but then you also have an entire culture around the misbehavior and cover-ups surrounding priests. Um, to think that this man had done these things was a really hard blow for me. A little while later, this was maybe a year later, I'd absorbed this a little more heavily and taken it on a little more internally. And I decided to do a little more digging into this story because I hadn't gone beyond that one article that I'd found. And I found this. Sanders, who was the prosecuting attorney involved, said DeStefano confessed to taking 2 Marines to dinner while on leave in San Diego last November. That sounds about right. Inviting them to his hotel room and serving them drinks, which he spiked with grain alcohol. Okay, that throws up a red flag for me right there. But I'll get to that in a minute. DeStefano, 45, then took photographs of one Marine in his underwear and committed an indecent act in front of the Marines, Sanders said. The priest hugged and kissed one Marine and fondled his genitals, Sanders said. DeStefano lied about the incident when first questioned by Navy investigators. DeStefano also confessed to serving alcohol to 2 minors while stationed at the Adak Naval Air Station in Alaska in '92. Okay, so that last bit, totally believe. He absolutely was the kind of guy who would say, hey, here's a 6-pack of beers, let's all sit down and have beers. The rest of it, though, causes a big problem for me. First of all, Sanders is not the victim in this case. I'd like to remind everybody he's the prosecutor. But secondly, this was in the don't ask, don't tell era. And this was also in an era where the federal government really liked to come down hard on people that it wanted to make an example of. I look at this description of these events and see one thing. I don't know what the reality is, and the likelihood is I never will. I will never probably have the full facts. I probably will never know who those Marines are, and I will probably never be able to speak to Neil DeStefano again, which is a shame because I have questions. So take what you will from that story. I know what I take away. This brings me back to why I decided to talk about these 2 men specifically. First, in the case of Steve Rogers, I want to acknowledge that I would love to be able to say his real name because I feel like he deserves credit. But at the same time, I also feel like if you can't find him on the internet, there's a reason, and that reason is probably his safety. So, Steve, if you're listening, I appreciate you, man. I love you, and I'm very proud of you. But more importantly, I didn't bring up Steve because I wanted to brag that I knew someone who was involved in the rescue of Captain Phillips. That was not my intention here. My intention here was to point out the fact that Steve doesn't know the effect that he had on me. Steve probably doesn't remember me. I mean, maybe if he saw that photo, maybe. But the point is that Steve had a profound impact on me. I don't want you to go around thinking about who had a profound impact on you. I want you to realize that you have probably had a profound impact on other people and not realized it. You've probably done something great. You've probably done something fantastic for a person that has touched them deeply. And they're carrying on because of that. And they carry a little torch in their heart because you did that thing for them, or you acted that way, or you were there for them when they needed it. That's important. Similarly, there's a reason I'm bringing up Neil DeStefano and why I'm using his name. What troubles me is that I have a very specific, personal, good memory of Neil DeStefano. It doesn't take away from the bad things he did if he did them. But here's my issue. When you go look up Neil DeStefano on the internet, the only things you're going to find out about him The only legacy he's leaving is the one that the Navy wrote him. It's one of sexual assault. Now, if he did it, maybe that's all he deserves. But the fact of the matter is Neil DeStefano left a positive imprint on my life, and I can't ignore that. So the reason I'm bringing him up today, and the reason I'm saying his name, because I want to record who impacted my life positively. I want to call these people out when I can. Like I said, I wish I could say Steve Rogers' name right here. These two men had a great impact on my life, and I feel like it's important for me to call them out, because none of us are getting through in this world alone right now. None of us are doing everything we're doing on our own. I feel like it's not that much to just say thank you, to say you helped me, you made me a better person. And both those men did. Next week, I'll likely talk about Coyote and Crow. Hope you found this interesting. Please bark at me if you have thoughts.